Have you ever heard of the phrase, "saved by the bell"? Today, we think of a boxer getting a lucky break, but its origins might be far more chilling. Back in the 18th and 19th centuries, a deep, primal fear gripped society. The fear of being buried alive. It was called taphophobia, and it wasn't just some fringe paranoia. Medical science was still in its infancy. People fell into comas or states of suspended animation that were easily mistaken for death. Newspapers were filled with horrifying tales of coffins being exhumed for one reason or another, only to find scratch marks on the inside of the lid and broken, bloody fingernails on the deceased. Or what they thought was the deceased. To combat this terror, inventors got creative. They designed what we now call safety coffins. These were elaborate contraptions. Some had feeding tubes, others had ventilation systems. But the most common and iconic feature was a bell. A string would be tied to the wrist of the person in the coffin. This string ran up through a narrow pipe to the surface, where it was attached to a small bell mounted on the headstone. The idea was simple. If the person woke up, trapped 6 feet under, all they had to do was move their hand, ring the bell, and alert the cemetery groundskeeper that a terrible mistake had been made. Someone would be saved by the bell. To make this system even more effective, many towns built special receiving vaults or mortuaries. These were small, often windowless buildings where bodies would be kept for a few days before burial. Inside, the caskets would be lined up, each with its own little bell system. A single night watchman, often called a sitter, would be hired to listen for the faint, desperate ring that meant someone had returned from the brink. It was a lonely, eerie job, spent in the silent company of the dead. And it's in one of these quiet, stone-walled mortuaries that our story takes place. Imagine a man named Arthur Finch. He was the sitter for the town of Blackwood Creek, a man well past his prime, with a steady hand and even steadier nerves, or so he claimed. He'd taken the job because it was quiet and paid enough to keep a roof over his head. For years, he'd sat through countless nights, the silence broken only by the wind howling outside or the scuttling of a mouse in the walls. The bells had always remained silent. They were a comfort, a symbol of caution, but ultimately just a feature of his strange workplace. He'd come to see them as decorations, nothing more. One cold October night, a new arrival was brought in, an old miser named Silas Croft. Silas was known throughout the town for being a cruel, friendless man who had amassed a small fortune by cheating and swindling his neighbors. He had no family to mourn him, and the townspeople who carried his simple pine box to the mortuary did so with a sense of relief, not sorrow. They placed him in the last empty slot in the wall, a cold, drawer-like compartment. As was procedure, Arthur took the thin cord, looped it securely around Silas's cold, waxy wrist, and threaded the other end through the small hole in the drawer, attaching it to a small brass bell that hung just outside. He slid the heavy drawer shut, the sound echoing in the stillness. The night began like any other. Arthur sat at his small wooden desk, a flickering lantern casting long, dancing shadows across the stone floor. The rows of drawers loomed in the darkness, each with its little bell, silent sentinels in the gloom. He read his book, sipped his lukewarm tea, and listened to the familiar sounds of the old building settling. Hours passed. The moon climbed high in the sky, casting a pale, silvery light through the single, grimy window. Arthur was starting to doze off, his head nodding forward when a sound jolted him awake. Ting-a-ling, ling. It was faint, delicate, but unmistakable. A bell. Arthur's heart leaped into his throat. He sat bolt upright, his eyes wide, scanning the wall of drawers. Every nerve in his body was on fire. He'd heard stories, of course, but he'd never believed them. Not really. He strained his ears, listening to the oppressive silence. Had he imagined it? Was it just the wind, playing tricks on an old man's mind? He held his breath, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his desk. Ting-a-ling. Ting-a-ling, ling. There it was again, clearer this time. It was coming from the far end of the room. from the newest occupant, Silas Croft. The sound was frantic, desperate. It wasn't the gentle sway of a settling body. It was the sharp, panicked ringing of someone fighting for their life. A cold sweat beaded on Arthur's forehead. Silas Croft was alive. The man everyone thought was dead, the man everyone was glad was dead, was awake in his coffin. Arthur's training, the procedure he had memorized but never expected to use, kicked in. He grabbed the heavy iron keyring from its hook on the wall. His hand trembled so violently he could barely fit the key into the lock on Silas's drawer. The sound of the ringing was incessant now, a constant, maddening jingle that echoed the frantic pounding of his own heart. He had to get him out. He had to save him. With a groan of metal on metal, he turned the key. He grabbed the two large handles on the front of the drawer and pulled. It was heavy, much heavier than he remembered. He braced his feet against the stone floor and gave a mighty heave. The drawer slid open with a deep, scraping sound. The ringing stopped. Instantly. The sudden silence was somehow more terrifying than the noise had been. Arthur held his lantern high, peering into the dark interior of the coffin. And then he saw it. Silas Croft lay there, just as he had been left. His eyes were closed, his skin pale and cold. He hadn't moved an inch. He was, without a doubt, still dead. But that wasn't what made Arthur's blood run cold. That wasn't the sight that caused a choked gasp to escape his lips. He looked at the bell, hanging silently outside the drawer. Then he looked inside again, at Silas's wrist. The string, the one Arthur himself had tied, was still looped around Silas's wrist. But the other end, the end that should have been attached to the bell, was not there. It had been neatly, cleanly cut. And it had been cut from the inside. A paralyzing fear seized Arthur. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. If Silas was dead, who rang the bell? And more importantly, if Silas was dead, who cut the rope? He slowly lowered the lantern, his gaze falling upon the other drawers lining the wall. He noticed something he hadn't before. On the drawer next to Silas's, and the one next to that, and the one next to that, were tiny, faint scratch marks around the keyholes. Old marks, covered in dust, but definitely there. His eyes darted back to Silas's compartment, and he realized Silas wasn't alone in there. In the deep shadows at the back of the coffin, behind Silas's body, something shifted. 2 points of light glinted back at him from the darkness, like animal eyes. A low, guttural chuckle echoed from within the pine box, a sound that didn't belong to any human. Arthur finally understood. The bell wasn't a warning for the living. It wasn't to save someone from being buried alive. It was a dinner bell. For years, something had been living in the walls of the mortuary, moving between the coffins, waiting patiently for a new arrival. And tonight, Arthur had just served its meal. He stumbled backward, his lantern falling from his nerveless fingers and extinguishing, plunging the room into absolute darkness. The last thing he heard before he screamed was the sound of the heavy drawer sliding shut, all by itself. So next time you hear that old phrase, "saved by the bell," maybe think of old Arthur Finch, and remember that sometimes the things we create to save us from our fears can end up becoming an invitation for something far, far worse. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from the shadows. Stay safe out there.